Alright, we are in the 5th part of the Great Northern War.
Peter left Poltava for Kiev shortly after the surrender of the Swedish army at Perevalojna. Once there, he sent letters throughout the continent, describing the details of the battle and his complete victory. Europe was left in complete shock. Until that moment, they had only received news of continuous Swedish victories. The Duke of Marlborough famously wrote, "We have no confirmation as yet of the battle between the Swedes and the Muscovites, but should it be true of the first being so entirely beaten as is reported, what a melancholy reflection it is that after constant success for 10 years, Charles XII should in 2 hours' mismanagement and ill success ruin himself and his country." The rest of Europe's elite had a similar disposition towards the Russian victory. However, some welcomed Russia onto the European stage. The famous polymath and philosopher Leibniz remarked that Peter would now be the Turk of the North. Charles himself only avoided capture by sacrificing the majority of his elite army and his most trusted commanders. Though Russian forces pursued the Swedish king, they could not catch him before he crossed the Bug and entered Ottoman territory. Sultan Ahmed III prepared a camp for Charles and his followers at Bender, and they would settle there for the time being. Peter was elated because of his grand victory, yet he was also equally disappointed due to Charles and Mazeppa's escape into Ottoman lands. Wasting no time, the Tsar entered diplomatic talks with Augustus of Saxony, Frederick of Denmark, Frederick William of Prussia, and George I of Hanover. The victorious Russian army was subsequently split in two. Sheremetev would move north towards the Baltic, while Menshikov would advance west into Poland. Stanisław, whose position in Poland was already negligible, saw his royal authority erode completely after the defeat of the Karolian army. Augustus repudiated the Treaty of Altenstadt and advanced into Poland with an army. The magnates of the Commonwealth, either out of dislike towards Stanisław or fear of Russian aggression, began endearing themselves to their former monarch and offered him the crown once again. Left without any alternative.
Dude, like nearly a decade of power, of success on Charles, what he did in like Poland and Saxony is now undone after that one disastrous adventure into Russia. That's insane. Everything is just falling apart. And he can't even get back to Sweden. Like, he's trapped. Like, oh man. Dang, dude. That sucks.
Stanisław joined the Swedish forces in their retreat to Pomerania and then abdicated. To compensate him for the lost crown, Charles granted him the Principality of Zweibrücken and named him Count Palatine. King once again, Augustus met Peter on the 9th of October at Turin. He feared Peter's reaction to having been abandoned in 1706. However, the Tsar did not hold a grudge. Nevertheless, at dinner, Peter could not resist an ironic thrust at Augustus's faithlessness. "I always wear the cutlass you gave me," Peter said, "but it seems you do not care for the sword I gave you, as I see you are not wearing it." Augustus replied that he prized Peter's gift, but that somehow in the haste of his departure from Dresden, he had left it behind. "Ah," said Peter, "then let me give you another." He gave Augustus the same sword he had given him before, which had been discovered in Charles's baggage at Poltava. The monarchs signed a new treaty.
Yo, Peter's a trip. I like Peter a lot. He has a lot of personality, like...
that effectively made the Commonwealth a Russian dependency in all but name. The Russians were allowed to station their troops in the Commonwealth. Peter would become the guarantor of the rights of the Polish nobility, while Augustus would join all of Peter's wars. One secret clause of the treaty was that Augustus would be allowed to claim Livonia. In the following days, Peter also established alliances with the Prussians and the Danes, who would enter the war again by October 1709. Although the Danish king was eager to enter the war and conquer, he did not take into account the readiness of his army. The best Danish soldiers were away, fighting in the Spanish Wars of Succession under the Duke of Marlborough. The 14,000 men that landed near Helsingborg at the end of November were inexperienced, badly supplied, and poorly equipped. The commander-in-chief of the Danish army, Christian Dietzlo Reyentlauw, wanted to advance quickly on the rest of Scania. The poor state of his army prevented him from doing so, and he only started moving from Helsingborg in January. Following the capture of Kristianstad, Landskrona and Malmö were besieged. Hearing of the Danish invasion, the general, Magnus Stenbock, started assembling an army at Växjö. Due to the fact that his army consisted mostly of recruits, he was hesitant to march against the Danes. Fortunately for him, the Norwegians could not organize their army at the time, and did not even launch a single raid across the border. This freed up several veteran regiments that were guarding the Norwegian border to join his army. On February 22, 1710, Stenbock started advancing towards Scania with a large force. Reyentlauw's initial plan was to capture some smaller settlements between Malmö and Landskrona, in order to gather supplies from the people there, and afterwards set up a strong defensive position to await Stenbock. The lack of supplies and winter clothing, however, took a severe toll on the Danish army. Disease spread through their ranks, and even Reyentlauw fell gravely ill. His replacement, Rantzau, proved far less capable. Rantzau abandoned his position in the south of Scania and moved back towards Helsingborg. Stenbock did not actively look for a big confrontation at the time, as he wanted to train his soldiers. On the 8th of March, Stenbock arrived with his army at Flensburg, 10 kilometers to the northeast of Helsingborg. Later, Stenbock marched his army towards Helsingborg, placing it between Palhweskog and Pilsudsvagen. Rantzau placed his army in a wide line in front of Helsingborg, facing Krupp. On the 10th, at 11 in the morning, the fog lifted and both armies were surprised to find each other in such positions. Both armies had approximately 14,000 men, with cavalry placed on the wing of Helsingborg, facing Krupp.
Okay, it seems like the Swedish have the advantage because they're directly facing the enemy.
On the 10th, at 11 in the morning, the fog loaded infantry in the center. The Danish also had several artillery pieces, however the exact number is unknown. Meanwhile, the Swedish army had 34 guns. Seeing that his left flank was vulnerable, Rantzau sent his artillery to Ringstorpshöjden, while the rest of his army wheeled towards the open plains where the Swedes were. Stenbock's forces came under heavy artillery fire around 12:30. Instead of attacking them directly, Stenbock moved his army to the left and sent his left wing to Drottninghög to outflank the Danish right. Rantzau went himself to attack and rout the flanking force on the right. Although it was a brave move on his part, this left the army in a difficult place regarding communication. In order to not lose contact with their right flank, the Danish center started moving towards the right as well. Some of the cavalry on the Swedish right used this opportunity to attack the Danish center. The Danes managed to push them back with the help of their left flank. However, this left many gaps in their lines. Rantzau's heroic actions earned him a shot in the chest, and the Danish right collapsed together with their leader. The right flank lost cohesion and retreated towards Helsingborg, and the left followed suit. The center still believed that the right was in front of them. Due to lack of command and communication, the first line kept advancing, while the second stopped moving. At that point, the Swedish infantry charged, covered by their cannons. The Swedish cavalry on the left subsequently converged on the flanks and rear of the center. The Danish center broke after some fighting, with only the Home Guard and a Grenadier Corps holding up a fierce defense. The Home Guard fought almost to the last man, taking many Swedes down with them. The Danish right formed a defensive line at Ringstorpshöjden, although they were forced to retreat after the Swedish left's relentless onslaught. At 3 in the afternoon, the Danish Grenadier Corps retreated in peace to Helsingborg, and with that, the battle was over. The Swedes lost almost 3.
Dang. All right. This is a battle that I think the Swedish needed to have to kind of rebound after Charles's complete failure in Russia. Like, all right, good attack on the Danes, but it's still, you kind of see the writing in the wall. I feel like things are just not good at all. Oh, yeah.
3,000 men, while the Danes had 5,000 killed or wounded and another 2,600 captured. Not wanting to risk losing more men on an assault, Stenbock surrounded the city. The leaderless Danish army boarded their ships on the 15th and crossed the Sound, but not before destroying anything of value in the city, including killing all the horses. As a result of his victory, Stenbock was promoted to Field Marshal. The Battle of Helsingborg effectively marks the last time that the Danish tried to reclaim Scania. Ironically, at the beginning of the invasion, the Danish army had "now or never" written on their wagons. As Augustus was consolidating his power in the Commonwealth for most of 1710, and the Danish were rebuilding their armies at the same time, the western front of the war went through a lull for most of the year. The same cannot be said for the eastern Baltic, though. Sweden's Baltic ports remained relatively undefended now that the Karolian army had capitulated. In July, Riga, Sweden's richest and most populous city, surrendered to the Russians after negotiating the restorations of old privileges for the Livonian nobility. According to the Treaty of Turin, Riga was supposed to be handed over to Augustus. However, the topic seemingly never resurfaced again. Dunamunda and Pernau fell in August, while Arensberg and Revel capitulated in September. The natural next move for Peter would have been towards Karelia and Finland. The Tsar already tried to take Viborg in 1706, however he was unable to do so because of a lack of supplies and proper artillery. With the war now going in his favour, he endeavoured to try again. In January 1710, Russian raiding parties started pillaging the countryside near Viborg. In February, the new garrison commander, Magnus Hoanstrael, received word that a large army was gathering at St. Petersburg and Kotlin. He asked his superior, Yuri Liebecker, for more reinforcements. The incompetent governor was seemingly not interested in fighting the Russians or fortifying Viborg, as he only sent a few hundred men, keeping the rest to reinforce the forts of Kexholm and Nislot, modern-day Savonlinna. In fact, Liebecker left the city just a few days before the Russians arrived. In total, the garrison numbered around 3,500, with 10 to 15 cannons, while the Russians arrived with 13,000 men. In the years after the first siege of Viborg, the castle had been undergoing repairs. Be that as it may, part of the fortifications were still weak, like the southern Pantzalax bastion. The Russian advance guard arrived 15 kilometers west of Viborg in the middle of March and reached the suburbs of the city on the 21st. There they clashed with two Swedish regiments. The Swedes retreated to the city afterwards, but not before burning the grain stores. The Russian army immediately started preparing the siege works. Digging trenches proved to be a strenuous and time-consuming task, as the ground was stony and still frozen. Nevertheless, by the end of the month, they would start digging trenches on the eastern side of the fort too. On the 1st of April, the Russian artillery corps started bombarding Viborg. This did not have much of an effect, as only small guns could have been brought across the ice. By late April, both sides started suffering from supply shortages. The Russian forces did not conduct many raids in nearby towns and villages, as Swedish guerrilla fighters frequently killed Russian troops there. Regular Swedish sallies were also devastating for the Russian troops. The Russian Admiral General Apraksin started planning to storm the city. However, he reconsidered after Peter told him that he would suffer the consequences if it would fail. The siege continued without any major events until the beginning of May. On the 6th, a Swedish sally killed hundreds of Russian soldiers and set fire to a part of their gunpowder stores. The fort's cannons also managed to destroy or disable several Russian guns. With the ice and snow now melting, the Russians could afford to bring more troops and supplies for the siege. Liebecker asked for aid from the Swedish Navy, as only they could save Viborg if the Russians brought their full force. relieving Viborg was not a priority for the Swedish Navy. In contrast, on the 11th of May, when Peter received Apraksin's letter that they only had a few days' worth of food left, he immediately set sail for Viborg through the still ice-covered sea. The ships arrived on the 20th, bringing the Russian besiegers precious food and another 100 guns. The unloading area was within shooting distance for the fort's artillery. To bypass this, the Russian ships flew Swedish colours and engaged in mock artillery battles with the men on the shore. The Swedish fleet finally reached the area in the last days of May. They didn't have a sufficient number of light ships though, so they couldn't engage the Russian fleet in any way. On the night of June 1st, the Russians opened a devastating artillery barrage that targeted the walls, the bastions, and the city itself. Meanwhile, on the eastern side, the Russian troops reached Pantsalax and placed a mine under the bastion. On the 6th, Apraksin decided that it was finally time to storm the city. Against his orders, on that very night, one of his officers attempted to do that only with his own units. The assault failed after the officer lost most of his men, and he was subsequently placed under arrest. It is possible that Juan Strail found out from one of his new prisoners that Apraksin planned to storm the city. Realizing that future resistance was futile, he sent an envoy on the 9th to negotiate the surrender of Viborg under good conditions. Peter signed the document on the 10th of June, which stated that the soldiers would be able to leave with their arms and their families. Peter did not keep that promise, and all of the defenders became prisoners of war. With this, Peter had finally achieved one of his main personal goals.
Dang. Yeah, Peter doesn't really care, does he? About, like, you know, he's more than willing to be deceitful if he needs to be. I mean, it works out for him, but, like, you know, still. And yeah, all that just completely back to Russia. I think it's mainly because Charles neglected Russia for so long until it was too late, you know?
To form a powerful defensive corridor around his capital, St. Petersburg. The Russians led several offensives into Finland during the next 2 years. However, due to logistical issues, they were unsuccessful. No sooner had Charles taken refuge in the Ottoman Empire, Peter had begun sending letters to the Sultan requesting the Swedish king's extradition. These letters became increasingly threatening as the months passed, much to the annoyance of Ahmed. Taking the last of Peter's letters as a personal insult, the Sultan declared war on Russia in October of 1710. The Tsar was still under the impression of his victory at Poltava, and this prompted him to enter the war with a much smaller army than the Ottoman one, relying only on the support of Moldavia and Wallachia. This war, known as the Pruth Campaign, ended in a swift defeat for the Russians, with Peter himself only avoiding being captured due to the incompetence of the Ottoman Grand Vizier. The subsequent Pruth Treaty stipulated, among other things, that Peter would allow Charles free passage to Sweden. Charles would not use that right, however, instead choosing to remain in the Ottoman Empire to try and persuade the Sultan to attack Russia again. In
Charles, go home. Go to Sweden. Go back to your base and, like, reestablish yourself, dude. I don't know, like, some things I didn't like. Some things I questioned is his relentlessness, unwilling to make peace when he could have had it several times. That's something I kind of, like, am a bit iffy about with Charles. But now this is also, like, you need to go home, dude. Then again, I don't know, maybe Peter wouldn't have even honored that. He probably would have captured him. But, yeah, Charles, you just need to go home, bro. Like, I don't know.
1711, the Allied forces began a massive offensive into Swedish Pomerania, besieging the fortresses of Stralsund, Stettin, and Wismar. But since the armies were more interested in raiding the countryside, the sieges were not effective. Additionally, disagreements between the commanders and a lack of siege artillery ensured that nothing of note would be achieved. In September, Stenbock landed on the island of Rügen with a large army. Alarmed at the prospect of facing a strong Swedish army, the Allied forces retreated from Stralsund and Stettin. As the Allies were insufficiently strong to take such well-garrisoned cities, they remained content with sporadic raids on smaller settlements. In the spring of 1712, another strong Swedish army arrived in Stralsund. Consequently, the Danish navy began tightening its grip over the Baltic Sea, which worsened the situation for the defenders of the Swedish forts. Stenbock knew that Stralsund would not survive a combined land and sea-based blockade. However, facing the combined Danish, Saxon, Russian army was not a feasible option either. In autumn, the Allied forces split up into two, so that one part could raid Mecklenburg. In the end, he decided on the latter option. Peter was in Dresden at the time, recovering from an illness. He was already furious because of the lack of coordination between the Allied commanders, and after hearing of Stenbock advancing towards Mecklenburg, he ordered his forces to engage in a pursuit without him. Stenbock advanced quickly, much faster than the Russian-Saxon armies did. On the 3rd of December, the Danish army encamped for winter quarters southwest of Wismar, near the town of Gadebusch. The Swedish army arrived at Wernau on the 14th, and by the 18th, they were already at Brusewitz, merely 10 kilometers away from the Danish army. At that point, the Russian army was south of Lake Schwerin and could not provide any assistance. Only a small Saxon cavalry detachment arrived to aid the Danish by the eve of the battle. Stenbock knew that any delay would be detrimental to his cause, so he marched his army through a snowstorm, arriving on the other side of the river on the morning of the 20th. Jobst von Skoltens, the leader of the Danish army, placed his forces behind a river and dense marshland near the village of Falkenstedt. The strong Danish defensive position made their leaders believe that the Swedes would turn south and try to cross the river at a safer point before attacking. After reconnaissance, however, Stenbock concluded that their only chance of victory would be through a full frontal assault. The Allied army was around 17,000 strong, with 8,000 Danish infantrymen, 5,000 cavalry, along with another 4,000 Saxon horsemen. The Swedish army had about 12,500 men, with 6,500 footmen and 6,000 cavalry. Both sides placed their infantry in the centre and their cavalry on the flanks. The Swedes had 30 cannons, while the Danish had 14. Jobst von Scholten led the Danish army, Jakob von Flemming led the cavalry on the left flank. Stenbock led the Swedish army. At 1 PM, the Swedish artillery opened fire, and the rest of their troops advanced. The Swedes were using a new type of cannon, which was more mobile and precise than the Danish artillery. Their artillery barrage not only managed to cover the advance of their troops, but also dealt heavy casualties to the Danish forces. The Swedish infantry advanced towards the Danish position through a narrow clearing. Adhering to the Karolian tactics, they advanced until they could discern their enemy's facial features and fired several devastating volleys. The Danish infantry returned fire, however it was not precise. Skoltens attempted to break the Swedish centre with a cavalry attack from the right. This attack failed due to precise Swedish volleys, as well as artillery barrages, and the cavalry retreated after suffering significant casualties. Afterwards, the Swedish left attacked the winded Danish right. This forced Skolten to wheel his entire army to the left to avoid being outflanked. Simultaneously, the Swedish cavalry on the right managed to find a small path through the marsh and attacked. The Danish left was caught completely by surprise and began retreating because of the relentless Swedish assault. The Allied army, though in a strong defensive position, was suffering from disorganization. Flemming, the leader of the Danish forces on the left, requested that the cavalry which was kept behind Falkenstedt be brought to the front on the morning of the battle. Skolten acquiesced, however his order came in late, and those cavalry regiments were caught behind the Danish left during the retreat. As they were unprepared for battle and caught in a position where maneuvering was difficult, disorder broke loose within their ranks. They were pushed back to Falkenstedt, where brutal fighting ensued. The quick and precise Swedish assault along the entire front pushed the Danish army back, and some units began routing. Unable to save their left flank, Fleming and Skultens retreated behind Verkenstedt and formed a new defensive line there. The Swedish left once again assaulted the Danish right. However, they were fired upon by the Danish Royal Guard and lost some of their momentum. Nevertheless, the Danish right almost broke, and Fleming had to reinforce it with his Saxon cavalry. The Saxons managed to stabilize the line. However, their attempts to push the Swedes back were unsuccessful. The Royal Guard still continued firing at the Swedish cavalry, causing many casualties. This forced Stenbock to send his elite infantry regiments to fight them, and the two sides engaged in a brutal melee. This engagement was eventually won by the Swedes, and the Danish centre began to retreat. The Saxons, though unable to defeat the Swedish left, fought fiercely and ensured that their enemies could not pursue the retreating forces. Most of the troops on the Danish left were either killed or captured, and only a few soldiers managed to retreat with the rest of the army. In the end, the Danish army lost all of their artillery and about 6,500 men, most of whom were captured, while the Swedes lost 1,500. Although this battle was a tactical success for Stenbock's army, it proved to be strategically insignificant. The Danish army was not completely broken, and the Russians and Saxons still had overwhelming numerical superiority. Furthermore, the Swedish army was no longer within the safety of Stralsund's walls, and marching back would be a risky move. A lack of supplies also began to take its toll on them, and to make matters worse, the Baltic Sea was still frozen, so resupplying by ship was not an option.
Dang.
Stenbock subsequently moved west with his army, trying to extort funds and supplies out of the Danish-controlled city of Altona. When the citizens failed to meet the overwhelming demands, the Swedish army burned the city to the ground. The army headed east afterwards. However, it was surrounded by a large Russian-Saxon force nearby Turning.
I will say I'm impressed that the Swedish armies, even without Charles being there, are still off fighting and still putting up pretty good resistance, at least outside of the Baltics area, you know. So I am very impressed by that, I must say. And, yeah, overall, I'm just surprised they're still in the game, you know?
His neutrality, Charles Frederick of Holstein-Gottorp provided refuge to the Swedish army inside his fort, as with the Spanish War of Succession nearly over, the Duke expected aid from Great Britain and the United Provinces, just like in 1700. Their ships never arrived, and with hunger and disease running rampant throughout his army, Stenbock surrendered on the 13th of May. Having lost another army, Charles seems to be in dire straits, with defeat being an increasingly realistic option. The Allied powers were more than willing to make peace with Sweden. Charles, adamant that he would not relinquish even an inch of land, refused even the most lenient offers.
Oh my god, Charles, just give it up, dude. You gotta make concessions, dude. I'm sorry. Like, you lost your chance. You should have made peace when you were on top, you know? But instead, he was too relentless, I think. Way too aggressive, unwilling to make peace when he could have. And it cost him everything. Now he's like, oh, I'm not giving up an inch of land. Yeah, you don't have a choice now. You can't rally. He's a stubborn guy, isn't he? Very stubborn man.
With the king so headstrong and averse to defeat, it became evident that war-weary Sweden would not sue for peace, at least not while Charles XII was still breathing. With Sweden's...
Okay, we're gonna finish the video in the next part, which comes out tomorrow, but that's a very ominous statement. Does that mean Charles has to die now? Or be removed from power? Let's find out in the end of this. I'll see you guys tomorrow in the final part.